that journey that began 25 years ago is far from over. It's now time to finish that unfinished business.
The Sustainable Development Goals cannot and will not be achieved until women, girls, and young people are able to control their bodies and their lives, free from fear and from violence.
We keep moving forward. We will not retreat. We will never give up. We are in a race to the finish line, and we shall prevail. Thank you. Nashukuru sana.
It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the second in a discussion series called Nairobi Commitments, ICPD25, What's Next? Global Thought Leadership Conversation. Today's session is titled Money in Our Pockets, COVID, Socioeconomic Consequences. And before we start, can I encourage each one of you to type into the YouTube chat some information about yourselves, where you're coming from, what you hope to learn. If you're on social media, can I ask you to use the hashtag What's Next for Women to highlight points, issues from the session. My name is Jacqueline Mahan. I'm the Acting Director of the Policy and Strategy Division at UNFPA, and I will be your moderator for this session. The COVID-19 pandemic has produced unprecedented direct and indirect impacts on health, livelihoods, economies, and lifestyles. The societal responses in many countries to mitigate the spread of the virus, including movement restrictions and border closures, have produced substantial ripple effects on income, health, education, employment, social protection, safety, and well-being. Today's conversation will explore the socioeconomic impacts and the mitigation strategies that are critical to minimizing the economic, social, and health consequences of COVID-19. We have a very distinguished panel that will tackle this issue head on. So without much further ado, let me introduce them. Let me first welcome Professor Radhika Balarishna, who is the Faculty Director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership and Professor of Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She is the Commissioner for the Commission for Gender Equity for the City of New York, on the Global Advisory Council for UNFPA, and was the co-chair of the Civil Society Advisory Committee for UNDP. She has a PhD in economics from Rutgers University. Let me also welcome Professor Naila Kabir, who is Professor of Gender and Development at the Department of Gender Studies and the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics. Her research interests include gender, poverty, social exclusion, labour markets and livelihoods, social protection and citizenship. Naila is currently involved in research projects on gender and labour market dynamics in Bangladesh and India. She has a PhD from the London School of Economics. I would also like to welcome Professor Isabel Ortiz, who is the director of the Global Social Justice Program at Joseph Stiglitz Initiative for Policy Dialogue, based at the Columbia University. Previously, she was the director of the Social Protection Department at the United Nations International Labour Organization, and has earlier worked at UNICEF, DESA, and the Asian Development Bank. She has a PhD from the London School of Economics. Last but not least, let me welcome Dr. Natalia Kanen, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. Dr. Kanen joined UNFPA in 2014 as the country representative in the United Republic of Tanzania, and in 2016 was named Deputy Executive Director in charge of programs. Previously, Dr. Kanen served as founding president of Elma Philanthropies. Dr. Kanen holds a medical degree from Columbia University and a master's degree in public health from the University of Washington in Seattle. It is with great pleasure that I would now like to welcome the Executive Director of UNFPA to make opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Natalia.
Well, thank you so much, Jacqueline. And I am delighted to be here. Welcome, everyone. This is our What's Next ICPD25 Global Thought Leadership Conversation. I really believe this is an important moment for strategizing. I thank you for joining me. And I, in particular, am forever grateful to you, Professor Radhika Balakrishnan, for conceptualizing and leading the organizing for this conversation. It is so timely, and it follows on the brilliant work that you and your various teams did on the road to Nairobi. Thank you. And I would also like to say how excited I am that the conversation is with none other than Professors Naila Kabir and Isabel Ortiz. Thank you for sharing your deep understandings with us. And I think as we build on these Nairobi commitments, as we push forward on the ICPD agenda into the year 2030, we continue to focus on what's next, even with COVID, even with the anti-racism work that we see we must do, even with some of the economies tanking. All of this means when we build back better, as the Secretary General has said, we have to reconceptualize money in our pockets. And we use the plural because the concept of sharing and solidarity, I hope we will figure out how to bring that forth. How do we keep the promise of Cairo alive in the COVID-19 era, in the year 2020, which is Beijing plus 25? So fast tracking progress for women and girls while protecting hard-won gains and re-envisioning the new normal. We set the stage in a discussion I had a week ago about addressing the pandemic within the pandemic, that is the violence, the gender-based violence that's been all too silently there all along. The conversation about upholding the rights of women and girls has to speak to all of the devastating consequences of COVID-19, and the socioeconomic picture is among them. The restrictions, the border closures that remain in place. While they're curbing the spread of the virus, it is bringing economic pain. It is bringing suffering, usually to the most vulnerable in the communities, in the households, everywhere. And there's no country that's spared from that reality. In the developing world, however, we want to hear from you how what we know is going to be a particularly devastating fallout will shift as it leaves the middle and high income countries that faced COVID in the main first, and now moves into less resilient economic systems that may have a harder time bouncing back, and women in fragile settings, in humanitarian settings. The economic shocks tend to affect us more. Many women make a living in the informal sector. So that's going to include tourism and all the other market occupations, et cetera, that are going to be affected by the safe distancing, social distancing measures. Where there's no job security, there's no safety net. And as we work during this crisis, we also know that when women get home, they're shouldering, again, those domestic burdens, which are rarely monetized. And the demands of caregiving for children, for the elderly, for others who are sick. Since the start of the outbreak, the United Nations has been sounding the alarm. Secretary General Guterres did warn in his report that the current socioeconomic situation could reverse the progress on gender equality and women's rights. It could exacerbate the feminization, so-called, of poverty. And certainly our predictions on the vulnerability to violence during lockdown is really an emergency. We've seen firsthand how, as the health systems break down, the protection systems also break down. Again, the poorest women and girls, the most marginalized, too often falling through the cracks. And we're seeing worrisome reports about higher incidence rates now for female genital mutilation and child marriage, as people believe somehow marriage will help them to escape, their daughters to escape poverty, erroneously. And as schools remain shuttered, what's going to happen to the girls who very likely will not be able to go back? So as we and our academic partners have just analyzed how the pandemic could undermine progress on our agenda globally, what we've seen is that the pandemic is interrupting health systems. It's interrupting programs that had been ongoing. This could contribute to 13 million additional child marriages and 2 million additional cases of FGM by the 2030 target date. Just simply staggering. I'll just end here by quoting the poet Audre Lorde. She said, "Life is very short, and what we have to do must be done in the now." Despite COVID-19, despite the anti-racism work that we all must do to change inequality and bring human rights to Black and Indigenous people, even with the expectation of economic contraction, regardless of the political pushback against sexual and reproductive health and rights, which we are seeing, UNFPA is keeping our eyes fixed on the horizon, the Nairobi Commitments, Agenda 2030. So what I hope to learn today is what works, so we can figure out together what's next. So I look forward to exploring some of these ideas with our exciting, wonderful, highly accomplished and well-versed panelists. Thanks everyone for being here. And back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Dr. Natalia, and thank you very much for your very powerful opening remarks and further setting the context. Now we will have 3 short presentations from our panelists. Professor Radhika, Professor Naila, Professor Isabel. Professor Radhika will look at COVID-19, the multidimensional crisis. Professor Naila will address COVID-19, the whole context of inequalities, and Professor Isabel will dig deeper into policies for COVID-19 recovery, including universal health coverage and reproductive health. So if I may give the floor to Professor Radhika to set us off. Over to you. You have the floor.
Okay.
Professor Radhika, okay, go.
You're on mute.
Okay,
Radhika.
I'm good. All right, I'm good. Thank you again. It's really an honor to be here and to be a part of this panel and work with UNFPA again, which was, I was in Nairobi and being a part of this movement is very exciting. So in the few minutes that I have, what I want to emphasize is that the COVID crisis is really a multidimensional crisis. It's an economic crisis, it's a healthcare crisis, and it's a crisis of care. And one of the things, to quote Naila Kabir, that this crisis has brought out is really, it has had a revelatory impact, right? Because it suddenly showed up and everyone looks at it. And especially in terms of the issues of inequality that Natalia started talking about, that didn't start with the COVID crisis, right? That has been around for a long time. When 1% of the world's population owns the wealth, owns 44% of the wealth of the world, we have a problem. And what COVID has done has really exposed those inequalities in a way that we need to acknowledge. It intensifies economic inequalities and vulnerabilities at this excessive economic inequality time. The apparent issues in terms of inequality of gender, as Natalia said, in terms of race, that is coming up. I mean, it's amazing that the world is finally acknowledging that slavery was really a horrible thing and that we need to deal with it. And also divisions of class, caste, what kind of jobs you have are all being exposed. And as Natalia has said, the issues of domestic violence and intimate partner violence is also coming to increasing by the minute. And the the lockdowns because of COVID have really exasperated the kind of issues that we've been dealing with. Now, so in terms of a response, we need a feminist response. We need to understand that these crises are have gendered impacts, and how do we look at them differently? Feminist economists like us have been looking and paying attention to the issues of the care economy and the importance of the care economy for a very long time. And I think, you know, all over the world at a certain period of time, everyone goes out their windows and bangs pots and, you know, claps for the care workers. But we need to look at care as part of the world economy and how it contributes to the economy. And it hasn't, until now, really received the attention that it needs to. And so, for example, the 2018 ILO report, Care Work and Care Jobs, they took a survey of 64 countries representing 2/3 of the world's population. And it says that 16 billion hours of unpaid household work every day in this survey. And of course, women did 76% of this work. That totals 4.4 trillion hours of work performed by women each year. That's unpaid. And it represents the equivalent of 2.2 billion full-time jobs based on a 40-hour work week. So the extent of unpaid care work in this economy is huge. And so why is it important for us to look at the care economy and the unpaid care work? I think during this lockdown is when the kind of work that women do at home has really been exposed in a way that I think was neglected before, and the contributions to it. So, and then in terms of paid care work, healthcare workers, nurses, all of those people are underpaid, but the most important, valuable workers that we see right now. And in terms of UNFPA's access to reproductive health care, all of that comes to the forefront during this COVID crisis. All right, so so a couple of the things that I want to highlight in terms of issues that we need to look at. We need global coordination, right? This is in 2008, when we had the financial crisis, we talked about contagion of the economic crisis. We now have that in terms of a health crisis, right? We have contagion of the health crisis. We have the economic crisis that I really don't think we're even starting to see the impact of it. I think it's going to be much worse as we move forward, right? Recently, there was an article in the New York Times that talked about, you know, expenditures based on class. And it showed that people who are of the lower economic strata spent as much as they did pre-COVID, because they spend most of their money on essentials. But people of higher income, there's like a huge decrease in their spending. The multiplier effect of that globally is going to be huge. We have no idea where the crisis is going to land and how it's going to impact. So we need global coordination. We need multilateralism for as important as ever is multilateralism. And we need to really rethink economic policy. And I have like 30 seconds left. And I leave you with a question that I think is a really important one that we need to think is, what's the economy for? We all participate in the economy. We're all a part of the economy, but how do we evaluate it? Do we only evaluate it in terms of the growth of GDP? Or do we look at it in terms of access to health, access to reproductive health, access to education, and we can look at a whole bunch of human rights standards that we can use to evaluate the economy. So I think we're a moment of global crisis that we need to step back and just say, okay, we can't just keep going normal. We need to stop and really rethink the way in which we've structured the world, which is really working only for a very small percentage of people, and the rest of us are being left out. So I made my 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Radigan. Thank you for keeping to time. Professor Naila, can I call on you to address inequalities in the context of COVID-19? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. We know from past crises that they do not impact uniformly across the population. They generally exacerbate pre-existing inequalities, so that certain groups of men and women and children tend to get harder hit than others. Who gets hit depends on the crisis. So if you have a financial crisis that leads to the shutdown of the tourism industry, then women are likely to get affected. If it shuts down construction, then men are likely to get affected. But this pandemic is like no other. It is global, and it has shut down tourism, construction, offices, factories, schools, restaurants, all the social spaces. So we are in territory that we've never been in before as far as crisis is concerned. The crisis has also given rise to a certain vocabulary of distinction, which I find quite useful in order to look at labor market inequalities from a pandemic perspective. And that is a distinction between essential and non-essential workers. Funnily enough, we now realize that we've been relying on essential workers all this time without realizing that they were essential. They're not paid very well, their skills are not recognized, but their work is what has kept the economy going, and that has looked after us when we have been unwell. They clean our garbage, they drive the transport, and of course, they run the hospitals and the healthcare system. And among these essential workers, it has been the health workers that have been the most essential. So, but even amongst the health workers, these inequalities have become evident, and they became very evident in the UK very quickly into the virus crisis. As the death toll mounted, we found, first of all, that men, for reasons that are not yet understood, are more likely to die of the virus than women. But we also found that health workers from the Black and minority ethnic groups in Britain were more likely to die than white workers. And some of the reasons were that they, in fact, the first 10 doctors who died in Britain were all Muslim, migrant, and from ethnic minority communities. But we know, of course, women make up the vast majority of health workers in the UK and everywhere else. And we also know that those who come from marginalized minorities are the most likely of the health workers to die. It's very true in Britain because they are lower down in the hierarchy. They're much more likely to face the public and be exposed to the virus. But we're seeing it in other places like India, where the statistics haven't come out yet. But we know that community-based women health workers who were never trained for this are now being expected to be the frontline workers in rural India and are being exposed to the infection on very, very little pay. So when we look beyond the health workers as essential workers, we find that wherever there are statistics being collected amongst essential workers, those from marginalized social are inevitably, am I all right?
You're fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are inevitably the ones that are most exposed. And so it's the Black and ethnic minorities in Britain, it's African Americans elsewhere, it's perhaps the Roma in Europe. Everywhere essential workers are from these communities are at the front line, at the highest risk. When we turn to the non-essential workers, we find also these social identities start to play out. For instance, in the US, women are more likely to lose jobs than men, but Black women are twice as likely to lose jobs as white men. In Canada, the childcare issue comes into play. So women who have children are more likely to lose jobs than women without children, and both are more likely to lose jobs than men with or without children. Those who have, even if they lose their jobs, have homes to go home to, they are able to continue working, they can stock up on supplies, they have savings to fall back on. But the category of non-essential workers who come from the have-nots are hit very hard. So if we look at the global south, many of the women who have been earning a living through their links in the global economy, that's now in meltdown. And we find that garment factories are closing down because the buyers are refusing to pay. Those who have migrated to other countries in search of work We find that women are more likely than men to be working for employers who have no responsibility for them. And we've all seen photographs of Ethiopian domestic workers locked out of their homes, locked out of employers' homes, but also locked out of the embassies that should have been giving them refuge. But of course, the worst hit, and this is what Natalia said earlier, are those who work on the informal economy, on the margins of the informal economy. And for these people, there is a very stark trade-off between eating, dying of hunger, or dying of the virus. And so for them, the imperative is to keep working. So we find in Bangladesh, the rapid appraisal tells us that informal workers have seen their incomes really plummet down, but those headed by women are about 3 or 4 days away from starvation. And in India, we know that it is those from the lowest caste and poorest states who have migrated in search of work. And many of them are, of course, women. And we are watching them on our television stream as they try and trudge home hundreds and hundreds of miles and die along the way of hunger and thirst. And interestingly, in India, Kanika Mahajan has pointed out that unlike in many other parts of the world, women are more likely to die of the COVID virus than men. And that tells you something about the pre-existing health inequalities among men and women. And then, of course, there is the large numbers of essential workers who are working from home, who are not even regarded as workers, let alone as essential. And we do find that their work burdens have increased now that children are at home, families are at home. And then that silent pandemic of violence that Dr. Khan talked about. We are finding statistics wherever they are being collected that domestic violence has gone up. And we don't know why that is. Is it because they cannot escape from abusive men? Is it because men have the strain of being locked in and not having freedom of movement they're accustomed to? Or is it in economic insecurity that leads them to take out their frustrations on women and children who are less powerful than them? We don't actually know, and we need to know. So one of the challenges for the future is to understand this link between economic insecurities and male violence. And it's also to understand the point that Radhika made. How come that we have allowed ourselves to live with an economy that allows some people to earn so much money and monopolize so much of the wealth, and that pays the people who look after us a wage that the Home Secretary in this country called an unskilled or a semi-skilled wage? So I think there are inequities in the market, in the global economy, that we need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Naila. And quickly moving on to Professor Isabel, who will address policies for COVID-19 recovery, including universal health coverage and reproductive health. Over to you, Professor Isabel.
Thank you very much. It is indeed an honor to be here in this session. As my colleagues were saying, this is an unprecedented crisis, and at the policy level, governments have taken strong actions in 3 main areas. First, health, clearly enforcing quarantines, mass testing, building intensive care units, etc. Second, fiscal stimulus plans. Some of the largest fiscal stimulus plans in history has been launched to protect jobs and the economy. And third, social protection programs at different types, such as income or food support, or sometimes subsidies to utilities or care services. Okay, this is very good, but if we want to protect lives, jobs, and human rights, even stronger actions are needed. First, health. We do need to invest in universal public health. And this is, a long battle. If any, of course, emergency support is very important and needs to happen now. But this is not only about, buying respirators and masks and emergency issues. The key thing is to continue investing in long-term universal public health systems, including reproductive health, because this is essential, to the health of the planet, simply. Now, if anything, the COVID crisis has shown is that the dismal state of many health systems in the world. health systems actually are overburdened, understaffed, and underfunded because of decades of austerity cuts and privatizations. Very often have been inadequate to support populations. So it's very important to go out of that mood, of that trend, and invest solidly in public universal health, which is one of the commitments of the SDGs, and all countries have agreed to. So it's about really putting the funds towards that. And I need to raise your attention that, of course, everybody will say yes now, but in a few months, we have historical levels of debt. And, because of the debt and fiscal deficit, ministries of finance might resort to the orthodox solution, which is cutting social expenditures again. And that will go back to a situation of underinvestment. Okay, so it's very important to keep that in mind. Second, with regards to the fiscal stimulus plans, these are happening as we are speaking, but we need to watch out that they don't go to the wrong hands. What it means, you go to corporations that are avoiding taxes, to corruption, etc. So if public funds are given to private corporations, it is very important that they are with strict conditions, like stop tax evasion, or using public funds to, to pay large dividends or to pay obnoxious management bonuses. Or it's very clearly that these funds need to go to protect jobs, to protect economic activity, and to pay workers decent living wages. Third, with regards to social protection, it's a bit the same as with health. Very often in these type of talks, people ask me, what is the best targeted scheme, for this crisis? The key thing to understand is that countries that have done well are countries that have universal public social protection systems in place already. To build a targeted scheme, it takes months to be designed and implemented. So it means that you're going to leave out of benefit to a large amount of the population. And there are many studies that show that already, during the earlier crisis. So what we need to do is to commit, to continue working towards, it was agreed in the Sustainable Development Goals, which it was to have universal social protection systems, including social protection floors. Okay, and these are policies all at national level, but it is very important to also look at the global level, as my colleagues were also saying. And for that, same levels. So health, it is very important that we look at the global governance of health. This is no time for small petty fights. This is the time to support the WHO and all the UN agencies working on health, including reproductive health, like UNFPA. For the international financial organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, or the other regional banks, this is very important to work with countries and governments to sustain universal public health and universal social protection now and after the crisis. So, because we're seeing that now they are supporting it, but what's going to happen in a few months with the higher levels of debt? So it's very, very important that we will work together, and these institutions work with governments to identify fiscal space and allow them, instead of having very limited funds, to actually have a large, pool of funds to we can expand this discussion in the questions if anybody's interested. And then there is also the issue of debts, and at the very least, we need to agree on debt moratorias, and then to later have some debt restructuring or debt relief, for the countries that need it. And this is fundamental, because otherwise we're going to see all these goals stopped. Look, this crisis, as Dr. Kenim was saying, this crisis, the crisis allows us, to do better. This is not the time to go back to normal. And being normal, a world where half of the population was below the poverty line of $5 a day, and the majority of people in the planet did not have access to adequate health services, including reproductive health services. So this is the opportunity we have to do it better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Isabel, and thank you to our three panelists. They've raised some key pertinent points and highlighted some critical issues that we need to address. And this next session, I'd like to go a little deeper to look at more what can we do and what actions can we take forward more generally. So I'd like to start with Professor Radhika. You provided a clear articulation of a gender perspective on the healthcare and economic crisis the world is facing. What actions do you recommend taking to encourage countries to look at this crisis through a gender lens? Over to you, Professor Radhika. I think you need to unmute.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you. I said I had a list of recommendations, and now that I've listened to Naila and Isabel, I've got even more recommendations. So I don't know if I'll keep it in time, but you can give me a minute window or something. I think the social protection programs are essential, as Isabel has said. They need to be gendered. We need to look at who is getting income. When money is going into the household, is it women who are going to control that money, or is it going to just go to the household? So we need to have a gendered analysis of social protection. And these are the parts that I wasn't going to talk about, but the issue of the debt is going to become huge. And not all countries can borrow money like the United States, where I live. There's all this money. They didn't have any money to start with, and then they've taken all this money. A lot of poor countries do not have that access to money. And right now, as I said in the beginning, this is a global crisis. So we need global responses. And so the tax evasion that Isabel talked about, the kind of issues of inequality that Naila talked about, how do we deal with that at a global level? So, I'll put out there, financial transaction tax. Now is the time to have that where there's a global pool of money so that we can use that to deal with these kind of crises. We need macroeconomic coordination between countries. The other thing that Naila pointed to is, the entire world economy is based on these supply chains where goods come from different parts of different parts of the world. That's going to change. What's the impact of that, right? In Bangladesh, the garment factories where all these women had jobs have closed down. Are they going to be those factories, right? Are the goods coming from China going to be the same goods that we look at now? In India, for example, the xenophobia, people are throwing their Chinese goods out the window to protest. But, it's an economic system that has radically changed. And I think this is the moment for us to stop and think about it. And going back to ICPD, and Natalia, you and I have talked about this, is the time for the D in ICPD, right? We don't emphasize enough what that D meant. And, I was part of the group during Cairo, with signs saying the D in ICPD. And ICPD did a lot to push that forward. We need to really go back and say, what does development mean? And how do we have universal access to healthcare? How do we stop the kind of economic inequality that we've seen over the last 30 years? I mean, it's not the COVID crisis that brought that about. That's been going on forever. And there's a reason why states don't have money. It's because they're not able to tax people in the way that they should. So let me stop. I know I've taken up more time than I should, but I have more if you want to.
No, we'll have an opportunity where we'll come together at the end to have some further reflections. I'd like to move on to Professor Naila. Why are certain social groups, the poor and marginalized within different societies, dying in larger numbers than others? And how does gender interact with class and social identity in shaping health outcomes? Over to you, Professor Naila.
Why are they dying? One interesting thing about focusing on labor markets and the inequalities in the labor markets is that for a lot of people, that is their life, okay? What they earn, they have no security, safety nets, nothing to fall back on. What they can earn in the labor market is a window into the rest of their lives. And if these socioeconomic groups are at the bottom of the economic hierarchy, if they're on the margins of the informal economy, if they have such precarious work that if they don't get a job tomorrow, they will not eat, then their ability to demand their rights or make any claims or have any bargaining power is very weak. They are the people who live in the most overcrowded houses. They are the people who live in the areas that are underserved. They're the people at the back of the queue when they go to a health center. They are the people who are going to get picked up by the police because somehow they've broken a curfew. So these socioeconomic groups, behind that concept is a coming together of a range of different inequalities. Inequalities of identity and respect, inequalities of deprivation, and inequalities of voice. So it is not at all surprising that they're dying in larger numbers. They started out less healthy. Those underlying health conditions that we've talked about are the product of poverty. You don't hear very wealthy people, suddenly dying of diabetes, this, and obesity, that. Those are the things that are concentrated at the bottom of the hierarchy. And I think what is also happening now, which is very worrying, is the xenophobia that's been unleashed. You see it in India, in the way that migrant workers are being treated. A lockdown at 4 hours notice, people arriving in their villages and being sprayed with disinfectant as though they're animals. Apparently that's happening in parts of Eastern Europe towards the Roma. They're disinfecting them from above. So, we are looking at deaths and illnesses, but behind that is a long intergenerational history of discrimination. And gender, in all of this, and I've kind of looked at the statistics, gender is that added disadvantage. It's that added, it's a discrimination on top of everything that goes with caste and class and race and so on. So everything that is wrong with the stigmatized identity is exacerbated in the case of women, partly because they are women and therefore, carry a burden of stigma with them, but partly because they have always been held responsible for what goes on in the family and the household. And their ability to go out and get a decent job for themselves and to have some degree of autonomy in their lives has been very restricted. So, why are we seeing a pandemic of domestic violence? Why, even in very poor households, are men turning on the less powerful? So I think the power dynamics around gender cuts across all of these different kinds of discriminations that we're looking at.
Thank you so much, Professor Naila. And if I may, I'd like to reach out to Professor Isabel with a question. We've heard about the inequalities and those most at risk of COVID-19 infection and the economic impact of COVID. How can governments implement and finance policies that stimulate employment, protect those in need, and support universal public health, including sexual and reproductive health? Professor Isabel, over to you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. This is a very important question, and I'm going to focus on the finance because what is coming with, as we were saying, with the amount of debt is at historical heights. So governments are going to say that they don't have the fiscal space to invest in universal health, universal social protection, and all the rest. So the reality is that this is an election of countries. Countries can choose to have more revenues or less revenues. This is a policy choice. And this is very important that if you decide to have this little budget or to have a budget this size, it depends on the policymakers of the country. And there are at least 8 options, 8, that are fully endorsed by the United Nations and by the international financial organizations that countries should explore now. So to start expanding fiscal space for all these needed investments. And let me give you the 8 and some examples. So you see, countries have been doing them for decades, but the thing is, we need to encourage countries to be aggressive in the search for fiscal space and not just stay there and have the little resources. You need to make effort, okay? Let's start. The first one that the IMF will always say will be, you reallocate public expenditures. And that might, and indeed we have very good cases of that. Let's pick Costa Rica or Thailand. They use part of the defense budget to finance universal health. So they are good examples. But of course, this has a lot of difficulties. So you must have to look at other options too. The most feasible option, and that will give more resources, is the one of increasing tax revenues. And this implies properly taxing, incomes, including corporate income and the financial sector, which at the moment is untaxed. This is a sector, a person having a little, shop in a corner store is paying more tax than a bank, which is absurd, isn't it? So these things need to change. And we have fantastic examples in developing countries too. For instance, Brazil put a financial transaction tax during the earlier administration. And we have had a case of developing countries like Mongolia, Zambia, Bolivia that have been taxing natural resources, the extraction of natural resources, and then use that for social development. So very good examples. The other, another option, third, will be to expand social security contributions, and you simply get social security, so we get health and social protection expanded. And we have very good examples in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, many other countries, Uruguay, that have been formalizing people in the informal sector that will solve that problem too, and then getting the funds for health and social protection. Fourth area that will give lots of resources will be fighting illicit financial flows. Illicit financial flows are illegal, okay? So they have to be fought. And this is from money laundering to, transfer pricing that multinational corporations do, to avoid taxation and others. And these actually, the amounts of illicit financial flows are huge, and that will really pay for the SDGs, So that is an area that countries need to really look at, and that needs to be done with global coordination, as Radhika was saying. That will be difficult to fight as a country alone. So that's why you do need to get yourself, to move towards that. Then you can, other options, and I'm going just to enumerate, and you can tap into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, and you have countries like Norway or Chile have done that. You can restructure your debt, and you have many good examples, Chile, Ecuador, Iceland, Iraq, and others. And you can adopt more accommodative macroeconomic frameworks. This means having some tolerance to inflation and fiscal deficits at a difficult time. Now, all these options are perfectly agreed by the international financial organizations and by the UN. So the key thing is that ministries of finance considers them, and the best way to do that is through national dialogue and a national public debate. Because these are not technical problems to be had, behind closed doors. These are problems that matters everybody, because this is the difference between having access to health, including reproductive health, or not having access to it. So it must be a national debate based on social dialogue.
Thank you, Professor Isabel. Thank you for your response. And if I may, I'd like to turn to Dr. Kanem. We've talked about inequalities related to the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. What action is UNFPA taking to mitigate these impacts, in particular to address those most in need? Over to you, Dr. Natalia.
Well, thanks so much, Jacqueline. I mean, it's just riveting hearing what's been revealed, the revelatory moment. Before I turn to what UNFPA is doing, and I have to say, I'm so excited that my colleagues rolled up their sleeves and got right in there, especially during this COVID era. I will try to incorporate some of what I say for the chat, because we have hundreds of people who are writing in the chat room. And as I've been fed some of the questions, I'll try to address them in my little vignettes. Yesterday, I had to go to my office in Manhattan, which is almost a ghost town, by the way. But there was a vendor on the street corner. So as I came back to my car, I witnessed an interaction that I interrupted, and I was so angry. The vendor is selling fruit and berries and avocados and Lord knows what else on the street, right? He's always there typically. And as a customer comes up, he says, okay, well, I'm going to buy these blueberries from you, but you're Chinese, so I hope I don't get coronavirus. And I just reacted. You know, like I was a bystander, but I was so upset about the stigma to this Asian vendor and the discrimination and just the whole tone when we're talking about anti-discrimination work. Leadership matters, and being able to interrupt the nonsense is where we all need to get to. And, you know, I also noticed that in, I didn't shout, but I was pretty, you know, snarling. I also realized that I was worried because you don't know what people are likely to do out here. You know what I mean? So I think we absolutely have to change the norm of silently letting these little micro and macro aggressions go by. For UNFPA, what we decided immediately is that when the health system is at risk, social protection plans, especially in humanitarian, emergency, fragile settings, migrants, refugees, et cetera, require a gender perspective. And so taking into account all of the specific constraints that we've been learning about here, the unpaid care by women, the risk to the midwife who's not being issued her personal protective equipment, but all of a sudden now you've got to wade in there and help. National response plans, and we work in over 150 locations, is where we've really focused. So expanding access to cash transfer programs. Give the woman the money in her hand and let her decide. When it comes to unemployment compensation and basic protections, especially for women in the informal economy, this is not normal, but this is what we're advocating for. And we're also asking pre-existing social protection programs under the national umbrellas to adapt, to disaggregate data. Who is disabled? What's the ethnicity? Are they rural or urban? Whatever it is. And to have methodologies that really ensure that we can measure and then deal with the income disparities that you've already expressed on the panel. Now, the wisdom of targeting financial support to hard-hit women-led enterprises, business, small, informal sector has been shown over and over, but the subsidies and the state-backed loans and the tax and the social security payment systems, these deferrals, these exemptions, they're not systematized. So this is something that we are advocating on the ground. Of course, we always, for a long-standing time in UNFPA, have always advocated for SDG 5 on equal sharing of responsibility by gender. Containment and mitigation measures also, the heightened GBV risks of lockdown for women and girls, including the inability to report violence or just simply to run out and get away. Being quarantined with someone who wants to harm you is a pretty desperate situation. So we've had to step up with hotlines, with shelters, and with advocacy to remove the abusive person and get rid of the perpetrator and let the woman stay in the house with her children rather than trying to disrupt her situation. In Georgia, in that country, for example, UNFPA has been encouraging fathers to step up with the new parenting challenges, the families who are self-isolating. So whether you're a male actor, writer, athlete, etc., they've been making videos showing themselves, reading the book to the kid at night or whatever, and this is being broadcast to kind of shift that social dynamic and to remind men that they are part of the solution, hopefully, as an engaged father, spouse, caregiver, et cetera, et cetera. Now, modifications to sick leave and parental and personal time off policies. This is another one where we've really seen we've got to open the way and make it a system, not just your benefactor instinct if you're an employer. This is part of the human rights dynamic of economic and social rights. Now, community-based protection systems. We've been trying to work in tandem with groups who are CSOs on the ground in our regular work, but especially also in the humanitarian sector. And we think that those community-based, community-led protection systems can really work at times like these. we've also tried to work with local communities and governments, local government, to try to re-envision what it is that we can do to protect adolescent girls who are also potentially trapped and being coerced into unwanted sexual activity, for example. Certainly child marriage, as I mentioned earlier, and FGM seem to be going up. So the communication around this is not the way to resolve the immediate issue is important. In Punjab province in Pakistan, UNFPA is helping to upgrade the Women's Safety Smart app. It's an app at the initiative of the Punjab Safe Cities Authority, and it helps women to report violence, to tell where their location, and to have that emergency helpline connected to the police when she sends a WhatsApp message. So I'll just stop here by saying disaggregated data is so key. If you're disabled, you're at higher risk. You can't read, you can't hear what it is that people are supposedly advocating in a time of COVID. For Indigenous people in every sector of the world, and this came through the chat room as well, we see the disadvantage of First Peoples, First Nations, Native peoples. This is part and parcel of everything that the panel has laid out very well. But the people with the power to choose, right, may not be showing leadership. And we see Indigenous communities stepping up, people of color, Black people, you name it, women's groups stepping up. And do we have the power to harness this? Shout out to young people who've taken it upon themselves to serve, some of them volunteering at this time. But I'm very concerned about their education, about their employment prospects. How are we going to help them to make their own job? So the choice that a powerful person, parliamentarian, head of state, you name it, makes for who gets the stimulus, what we do about debt. And printing money doesn't seem to be a problem in the immediate instance. I mean, the deficit hawks are not stepping up when it's business that's being, but I think all the points that were made about who's essential and that redefinition, very, very apt. So it does once again come down to choice. And I suggest we choose wisely and that we choose international solidarity, especially for the most vulnerable people on the planet. Thank you. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Natalia. And if it's okay, we're going to go a little bit over time because the discussion is so rich. And so I hope those online will be okay with us to do that. I just wanted to go back to the panelists. Any comments on what you've heard now, if you'd like to come in before we go to our final session, any further reflection on what you've heard from each other?
I'd like to, can you hear me?
Yes. Please go ahead, Isabel.
Okay, I'd like to pick up on just two things. One is picking up on something Isabel said, and that is, I find, the whole issue of taxation, one of the most simple things that we could be taxing in this country, in the UK and in South Asia, is wealth, land. There is no tax on land. No, and we could also think about inheritance tax, the way in which inequalities get reproduced over time because of passing on wealth, to the next generation is something I think we also need to look at. And on the issue of measurement, Dr. Natalia, I'm finding a really interesting politics going on around measurement. It's very interesting in Britain that in the beginning, they didn't count how many nurses died. They just counted the doctors. Now they're counting the nurses and the doctors, but they're not counting the people in the old care homes who are dying. And there is this real attempt to try and keep down the numbers of people who are dying. Brazil has given up counting it all. I'm not sure where Trump stands on this. But the other interesting thing is in India, in Delhi, the number of deaths reported by the Delhi government that have linked to COVID virus are far fewer than the number of COVID-related funerals. That's just my friend Ashwani Deshpande pointed it out. And I was thinking that, in Bangladesh also we're not counting, but you cannot hide funerals. And that's where we're going to get some sense of, but of course that doesn't disaggregate along the lines that you were talking about.
Thank you, Professor Naila. And I wish we had more time, so I'd like to bring us to the final question, if that's okay. So the final question is about the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19, or FAST, and inequalities in gender, race, and socioeconomic class play a substantial role in who it most impacts. And we've already touched on this, but can we think about productive ways, as we think of productive ways to move forward to mitigate both the negative impacts as well as the lessons learned? What are the key takeaways you would recommend? And can I start with Professor Radhika? I think you need to unmute. Go.
I did. I actually remembered to do it this time. I mean, as I think the way we've all talked about is that the revelatory impact of this pandemic is showing us that where we've been for 30 years has not been good. And I think Natalia said that, you know, we don't want to go back to normal because normal wasn't very good. So how do we use this moment to actually change the way we think about the way the economy is structured, the gendered aspect of the economy? I mean, my own work and others is how do we use the human rights framework to actually look at how the economy works and see whether that could be the normative framework by which we judge the economy? Can we say, I mean, I know like countries like New Zealand and others are saying, can we look at well-being as a way to judge an economy and how it's doing? And so I think we really do. We're at a moment of crisis, global crisis, and either the global crisis will make us go far right, or it will give us a moment of really coming together and thinking about a new way in which we run our economic system that deals with issues of gender, the unpaid care work, why women end up in the informal sector, and all these things. And then the last thing I want to say is that, you know, the role of the state for the last 30 years has been like, you know, the state should stay away from everything. When there's a crisis, the state is the one that has to respond. So how do we then use this moment to really think about the role of the state? And, you know, one of the questions I'm grappling with is, you know, when the state is asked to come out and deal with public health issues like asking for quarantine, you have people saying, I have the right not to wear a mask and show up in state capitals with guns. So, you know, what is the dynamic between the kind of protective role of the state in terms of public health, and then the civil liberties issues of, you know, people's need to express themselves? So I think we need to really think about what kind of state do we want, and what are the ways in which we evaluate that role of the state.
Thank you, Professor Radhika. And quickly moving on to Professor Naila. Over to you. I think you need to unmute.
Okay, good. All right. Sort of picking up from Radhika and the issue of rights and using a rights-based approach, I'd like to also think in terms of what we have learned from this crisis about capabilities and about human capabilities, that we have recognized that all of us have a universal need for certain services, starting with health, you know, starting with reproductive health, basic health of various kinds, but also education and all the other things that make human beings productive and agile and able to deal with a very uncertain world. So I would like us to think in terms of using some of the social protection thinking and the rights-based thinking to have, you know, care is one element of it, but I'm talking about a much more expanded version of investing in human beings, so that whatever crisis comes along later, and there will be others, they will be in a position to make sure that they don't get, you know, marginalized and pay the costs in the disproportionate ways they have.
Thank you, Professor Naila. And if I may, Professor Isabel?
Yes, I'm going to pick from Naila. actually, yes, after this crisis, where we're going to see a world with more poverty, with more inequality, with recession and crisis. But not all is wrong. Actually, what we see now is an acceptance on the importance of universal public health. This was not there before. In a country like the US, talking about public health was considered almost socialist, you know? So now we have, you know, everybody talking about that. We realize that at stake is the survival of the planet. So we do really need to invest in, for the long term, not just for emergency, in universal public health systems, including reproductive health and universal social protection, etc. And for that, there is another positive thing. The role of the state has been, strengthened. The fact is that all these years of very orthodox liberal policies have been weakening governments. And when the crisis came, you know, to the surprise of the majority of people, many governments were actually weak, you know, when it was needed a strong reaction. But the states themselves, governments themselves, realized that they needed more powers. And this is happening. So governments are getting, you know, strengthened powers, and they are doing more things. And as the months pass, you know, they are seeing better responses. So that is also a positive thing. Now, that does not mean, as Radhika was saying, some are taking this for their own profit, you know, let's say, and taking these advantages towards, you know, strengthening right-wing movements and things like that. But anyway, reality is that we are seeing the need for stronger states to really achieve simply the sustainable development goals that they were agreed at the United Nations by all governments. So we need stronger action.
Thank you so much, Professor Isabel. And we're coming very close to the end of our session, and I want to thank the panelists, and I'll go into more depth later, but to responding to the questions and raising some really, really very pertinent points. Let me hand over to Dr. Natalia for concluding remarks on this session. Over to you, Dr. Natalia.
Thank you. It's mainly agradecimientos. Very exciting to have you with us. Another poet, Sarah Williams, wrote, "I have loved the stars too fondly to be fearful of the night." So even as instability and financial hardship from COVID is leaving women and girls more vulnerable, not just in terms of health, as we've heard, but in social and economic systems as well, I hope that our work together can help to mitigate some of the socioeconomic impact. And that goes for countries that have been termed middle income. The Caribbean rightly is pointing out that being middle income does not protect you during a pandemic when the base for your economy evaporates overnight. Similarly for the Pacific Islanders, and they have also reminded us, the island states, of the interlinkages between climate and the issues of sexual and reproductive health as pertain to the pandemic. So building that resilience for women and girls, building back better, will imply that even with the knock-on effects that we have heard, and it's very sobering, will be painful and costly in the years to come, our collaborative approach, perhaps, with a strong gender imperative, can help to build back better. You know, that's the phrase that Secretary General has been using. For UNFPA, we will never accept that women and girls are going to be disregarded and have them fall behind. I mean, it's not inevitable collateral damages. There are choices. So who we choose in a time of crisis makes a difference. I hope that we will leave here reinvigorated to go out there and invest in women and in young people who are on the ground, so that they can lead us in figuring out how to cushion some of these blows and to lift vulnerable people back up. So from me, thank you for joining me. This What's Next conversation is part of our road out of Nairobi and into 2030. Last year, we asked what's changed, and we said a lot has changed, but we have a far way to go. And when we think about what's next, I think it's solidarity and being made privy to some of these very important concepts that the outstanding panel has put in front of us. So we're very grateful to you. I think we look up at the stars. We don't have to fear the night because we look for that light. And even during COVID-19, if we listen, and I think if our minds are open to discovery and new possibilities, that we ourselves can expand what's possible. So again, thank you very much to the wonderful panel. Very, very, very grateful to you. And also thanks to my team, Howard and Alvaro and everybody who behind the scenes, Nagina has helped us to pull this together so well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Natalia. And again, I wish to thank all our distinguished panelists, Dr. Natalia Kirkanen, Professor Radhika Balakrishna, Professor Naila Kabir, and Professor Isabel Ortez for their very insightful comments. And I also wish to acknowledge the great turnout that we have seen for this event. And we're very much looking forward to having you join us at the next Global Thought Leadership conversation on the subject of generation equality and bodily autonomy, empowering girls in the time of COVID-19, which is going to be scheduled in July. So please watch this space. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.